Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Choosing the right prime lens can be a bit of a daunting task. There are so many different options on the market and many photographers have their own preferences. These people are using a 35, these people are using a 50, and you just can get in the position where you end up either buying everything or just buying nothing and being confused. Well, in this video, I want to try and simplify the whole process of getting your first prime lens. Now, a little while ago, I did make a video where I said if you're not sure and you have the option to buy one, get yourself a good quality zoom lens, and then over time you'll figure out where you sit in, let's say, a 24 to 70 focal range. And at the end of it, you can get the right prime and also have your zoom as a backup. However, there is a group of people who either don't like zooms, don't want to use them at all, or just can't afford to buy a good quality zoom and would rather just get straight into prime lenses. And this video is for you. So I'll go through the most common street, documentary, travel photography prime focal lengths, talk about the pros and cons of each one, and discuss why you should consider one over the other and what you might expect in return from that lens. Now, for the purpose of this video, I'm talking just about the focal length. I'm not talking about specific primes and models versus the others. And also, everything I'm going to discuss is just based on my own style of photography. So if you've been following me for a while, then this will apply to you. If you're new here, then have a quick look on my Instagram or my website, and you'll get a feeling of my type of work, and then you can decide for yourself whether my opinion is relevant to you or not. Let's start with some key criteria that will definitely steer you, at least in a rough direction initially. So the first criteria is, what's your favorite environment? Where do you like to shoot? Do you prefer tight, narrow streets in the Middle East? Or do you prefer wider, more open areas which are maybe more to do with landscape photography, not necessarily street? Because where you prefer to shoot will really determine what prime lens you might want to be considering. Your subject. Are you taking photos in locations where people are a little bit more cagey about photography? Maybe photography is not as welcome there. Or are you taking photos in an area where everyone is welcoming, where everyone wants their photo taken, and you can be very close up with other people without worry of upsetting them, offending them? Maybe your subjects are not even people, because technically you don't need to take photos of people for street photography, at least in my opinion. So whatever your subject is, just have a think about what will that subject's reaction be to you being there, because all of that will have an effect on what prime lens you select. And finally, it's the story, the feeling side of photography. How do you want your viewer to feel? Do you want your viewer to feel like they're right there with you? They could smell the scene. They're right in the middle of it. Because if so, then you'll probably need to use one type of lens. However, what if you want your viewer to feel more like a fly on the wall, more like an observer from the distance? Well, that's when a different type of lens comes in. Once you've really had the chance to think about these, you will definitely have at least an initial direction for which prime you might want to get based on what I'm going to discuss later on in the video. Now, there isn't one prime to rule them all, and there is definitely merit to having 2 or 3 different primes. But for now, let's just stick with one, and then we might add a second one later on in the video. Let's start with the first prime, which is the 28mm. Some people do go wider to around 24mm, but 28 seems to be quite a popular one for street photography. This can be a very intimidating focal length because it involves so much of the scene and it requires you as a photographer to be right in the middle of it. So if you're uncomfortable being in busy environments surrounded by people, this lens might not be for you. At the same time, if you love being right in the middle of the action, you love getting close and personal with your subjects, you love getting your camera into particular situations where you can get very interesting angles and perspectives, then a 28mm is going to be perfect for you. Also, if you love to have multiple elements and layers in the scene, you can achieve that with the 28 a bit more because you just have so much more room to work with. On the other hand though, if you're still nervous with using such a wide angle lens or maybe being that close to people, you can take a couple of steps back and you have a huge area to play around with. So you can even aim your camera at a certain subject, but because it's so wide, it doesn't look like you're aiming your camera at them, so it gives you a bit more sort of room to breathe. And also, if you're using like a very high megapixel camera, then you do have the option to crop. What will this lens achieve for your viewer? Well, it will put your viewer right next to you. When your viewer is looking for your images, they will feel like they could physically be there themselves, that they could touch the subject, they could smell the subject, they could smell the scene. And I don't think there's anything else in terms of lenses and focal lengths that will come close to putting your viewer in the scene. So if that's the look that you're going for, if that's the feeling that you want to evoke, then this lens is definitely one that you should be considering. And finally, this is the lens that I would typically use as my establishing shot lens. So if I am, let's say, putting together a bit of a story about a location, then I would need an establishing shot. Doesn't necessarily have to be the most pleasing photo, but a photo that can give you in one hit an idea where you are, what's happening. And nothing better does it than just a wide angle shot of what you could see, and that's where this lens comes in perfectly. There are two focal lengths which are synonymous with street photography, and the 35mm is one of them. So much so that you have dedicated cameras that come with that fixed focal length, like the Fuji X100V that so many people love. And there's a good reason for it. 35 is probably the most useful focal length that you can have for a city walkabout, street travel type scenario, because it can cover so much. It's wide enough to make the viewer feel that they're there with you, but it's not so wide that you lose context or at least a direction of what your photo is about. You can use it as an environmental portrait lens. It's fantastic for taking photos of people in the environment, where the environment is just as important as the person within the frame. And finally, it's a very comfortable focal length to shoot with, because you're no longer in the middle of the action, but you are, let's say, at an arm's length away from the action, which means you don't need to push boundaries with regards to how close you can get to other people, subjects within a particular environment, but you're still there with them. And it's one of the only focal lengths that you can go out with just that for the whole day and not feel like you're missing out by not having something else. As an example, my entire day in Jerusalem was on the 35mm. I had the X-T3 and the 23mm f2, which is a 35mm lens, and at no point did I feel like I needed something else. I mean, maybe sure, if I was on one of the rooftops and I wanted to zoom into a particular thing, fine, but for 90% of the time I was very happy with just having a 35. Same goes for the previous video that you've seen, which was in Dubai's Al Seef Old Town. I just had the Fuji X100V. Sure, when I was on the boat, it would have been nice to maybe have like a telephoto to just quickly zoom into a particular area, but generally speaking, I wasn't panicking, I wasn't worried or annoyed that I didn't have anything else with me, and the 35 covered that entire day out perfectly well. So honestly speaking, I would recommend the 35mm to everyone, and I would go as far as saying that if you're not sure what is the first prime you should be getting, I would get the 35, because there is so much you can do with this lens. And even in years to come, when maybe you're shooting more telephoto, there will always be a scenario where having a 35 with you will prove to be a good choice. At this point, I want to say a huge thank you to today's video sponsor, which is Squarespace. These guys have been backing me up for a while, and even before the YouTube sponsorship, I've been using them for a number of years. It's a fantastic platform that allows me to connect all of my business services and put them under one roof, under one app, with a very easy, simple way to manage everything I possibly need. So if you want to make something similar for yourself, I do highly recommend Squarespace. If you use the link below, you'll get 10% off your first purchase after your free trial, and honestly, I can't recommend anyone else. These guys have been helping me run my business for the last 5 years, and without Squarespace, I will probably have to do a lot more admin. Just like the 35, the 50mm also has its staple part within the street photography community, so to speak, because it's one of those lenses that really allows you to slow down and to work on the composition and to work on creating unique images within a busy scene. There's a reason why people love 50s, because it allows them to be a little bit further away from the action, to observe, and then to compose something unique, which maybe a wider lens might not be able to achieve. For me, this is my go-to focal length if I want to really focus on the craft, if I want to focus on finding unique compositions, on improving as a photographer, on looking for moments within the scene, this is my go-to lens. If the 28mm is for your establishing shot, this would be for your detail, for your subject, and for your point of interest in the scene. So for example, when I went to New York in December, I only had 28 with me and the 50 on 2 different bodies, and between them I was covered for pretty much everything. Again, the only time I wished I had a different lens was when I was, I think, on the rooftop or something, and I needed a 70 to 200 to get something in the distance, but that's not really within the context of this conversation. But in terms of just the primes, I was honestly very happy with that setup. However, if I was going out with the intentions of just documenting my day out, I would still prefer to have the 35, because the 50 can be a little bit too tight for that. Because if the 35 is at arm's length away from whatever you're shooting, the 50 is more like a few steps away and maybe across the path. And sometimes it can feel like you're just too restricted and everything's a bit too tight, and you always need to take a few steps back. So whenever I took the 50 out, just in my experience to document, I was always taking a few steps back, whereas with the 35 I didn't need to. However, when I took the 50 out with the intentions of making interesting compositions and just looking for interesting images rather than documenting, then the 50 obviously was much better, whereas with the 35, I felt like it was a bit too wide for that. In terms of environments, this lens does lend itself towards a slightly more open environment. If you take this to a tight, busy market, you'll just be picking out interesting details. You will not really be able to encompass how the whole place feels in one image unless the market's quite open or you manage to go back or find an interesting vantage point. Other than that, cities such as New York will be quite good with the 50 because they are a little bit more spread out and you have a lot more straight lines and a lot more straight roads. So the 50 and the compression you'll get with the 50 will definitely work well over there. Other than that though, I would definitely say keep the 50 for the more interesting and the more intimate images, and then keep your 35 and your 28 for more establishing images or images where you want the viewer to feel like you're right there with them. And the final prime I want to talk about is the 85mm, which is definitely now heading into the telephoto territory. Now, even though it's still a very common lens, most people do tend to stay away from it and use something like a 50, 35, 28. However, there are a few select photographers which love something like an 85 and swear by it. The reason for it is because, to put simply, an 85mm lens really allows you to focus on your subject and to really find details within the scene. It's also a lens that will create the most layers when it comes to the compression and when it comes to having different elements of the image out of focus. However, there are many people that don't like this lens because it does feel like you can sometimes be detached from what's happening in the scene. Now, obviously, if that's a look that you're going for, then this is the lens that will achieve it. However, if you want people to feel connected to the image, then using such a long lens might not achieve that. And also there are other groups of people that think that this lens is bordering on being a bit of a pervert and just like spying on people, so to speak. Not sure I agree with that, but I do see where they're coming from. Personally, I do think this lens has its place in your kit because you have your wider lenses for your establishing shots, for your immersive shots of the scene, and then you have this lens which is for your details, which is for picking out random little things within the scene, which is maybe focusing on one particular person or maybe from a certain angle having them as a silhouette, but then having everything else out of focus or appearing more compressed. This definitely does have its place in the wider kit, but it's not a lens that, at least from my experience, I've used all that much on its own. So who's this lens for? Well, if you are 100% set on taking photos of people from like across the street, which is basically what this lens will allow you to do, then this could be for you. Maybe you live somewhere that is so open, that's so remote, that using such a long lens is the only way to get close to anything. Fine. Maybe you like that sort of telephoto look, that compressed look. Again, fine, but just at least in my experience, the longer the lens, the less of a connection that I have with the image I've just taken. and then that will also translate to the viewer, which is why whenever I use these longer lenses, it's more for like an abstract photo, which just looks nice, but might not have any real connection, or it's for details within a larger scene that can be used as, let's say, a little sprinkling on top of a photo album to give it a bit more of an, let's say, 3D dimension, so to speak. So to summarize, there is no one size fits all when it comes to primes. Sure, there are one or two staple lenses which I do recommend everyone owns, such as a 35 or a 50, but ultimately the only person that can decide which is the best prime for them is yourself. Now, if you're still not sure, I would say go on the wider side just to be safe, because you can always get closer to your subject, at least digitally, if you can't physically. Whereas if you go for like a 50 or an 85, you can't always go back. Now, if you're still not sure and you want me to give you one definitive answer as to what prime I would suggest, I would say go with a 35, because you're just simply not going to go wrong with that focal range. And even if you decide you're not using it as much, you prefer something tighter like an 85, then you can always add an 85 to your kit, and then you have a much more dynamic kit. And then if you do need to go wide, you have that option in the future. But honestly, for most people, a 35 will cover so many things that it's a very easy suggestion to someone who's starting out. Now, hopefully you found this video useful. If you do have any questions or comments, please write them down below. If you think I've missed something out, or maybe I've said something that you don't particularly agree on, again, write it down in the comments. Thank you again. Hope you're enjoying your day, hope you're enjoying your week, and I'll see you soon. Bye.